Um, Good morning. As Chris said, my name is Shawn Woodford. I am currently employed as a historian at U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, but I am an alum of the DuPuis Institute. In fact, Chris was the person who gave me my first professional job in the field. So I still say working for TDI was my favorite job of all the ones I've had since then. And I can still say that. So at the outset, let me say I am speaking only for myself. None of my views reflect U.S. Navy, the U.S. government, or the DuPuis Institute. I'm simply here speaking on my own. And unfortunately, as Chris said, I gave this presentation before in 2016, and I went back to revise it and realized when I got it done, doesn't tell a particularly happy story. But today I'd like to speak about the challenge facing the U.S. military analytical community. The fact that its intellectual understanding of real-world combat phenomena rests on a narrow empirical foundation. This is known as the base of sand problem, and it has been long-standing. But let me start with the recent past. Slide. In early February 2022, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley briefed Congress on the buildup of Russian military forces along the border with Ukraine. They reportedly offered a pessimistic forecast for a potential invasion. Full-scale Russian attack would capture the Ukrainian capital Kyiv in 48 hours, toppling the government. The conflict would result in 5,000 to 25,000 Ukrainian and 3,000 to 10,000 Russian combat dead, and cause 25 to 50,000 civilian deaths. Excuse me. While U.S. intelligence accurately predicted the Russian attack that began in February, to the surprise of nearly every Western military and civilian analyst, Ukraine's armed forces fought the Russian army to a standstill and then forced it to withdraw from northeastern Ukraine in April. As of now, the military outcome of the war remains indeterminate, perhaps even trending in favor of Ukraine. What is now clear is that the U.S. military analytical community overestimated Russian military capabilities and underestimated those of Ukraine. Their collective forecast of the combat outcome proved inaccurate. These estimates clearly influenced U.S. policy decisions in the lead up to the conflict. That attracted the attention of Congress. The Senate Intelligence Committee instructed Haines to report on the intelligence community assessments of both Ukraine and Afghanistan, where Afghan military forces collapsed unexpectedly quickly during the U.S. military withdrawal last year. Haines told lawmakers that the National Intelligence Council would review how the agency has assessed both, quote, will to fight and, quote, capacity to fight. These issues are, quote, quite challenging to provide effective analysis on, and we're looking at different methodologies for doing so, Haines told Congress. I would point out that that briefing in February was only partly done by the intelligence community. It was also reportedly done by, the operational assessment was done by the U.S. Joint Staff using methodologies that are unknown because it's pretty likely that they didn't base it on any modeling or simulation because they don't have validated models for forces that don't involve U.S. troops. So exactly how they came to these estimates is kind of a mystery, and appears to be a mystery to the intelligence community as well. Slide. So now I'm going to go back to back into history and trace how we got where we are today. Modern U.S. defense analysis can be traced back to the emergence of operations research during World War II and its integration with traditional military planning and intelligence. Combat modeling in the U.S. began in the early 1950s as an extension of military operations research. Early model designers did not have a large base of empirical combat data from which to derive their models. Although a start had been made during World War II and the Korean War to collect real-world battlefield data from observation and military unit records, an effort that provided useful initial insights, no systematic effort has ever been made to identify and assemble such information. In the absence of extensive empirical combat data, model designers turned instead to concepts of combat drawn from military doctrine, subject matter expertise, historians and theorists, the physical sciences, or their own best guesses. As the U.S. government's interest in scientific management methods blossomed in the late 1950s and 60s, the Defense Department's use of operations research and combat modeling and planning and military and budgetary analysis grew as well. By the early 70s, however, it became evident that basic research on combat had not kept pace. A survey of existing combat models by Gary Shubik and Martin Brewer for RAND in 1972 concluded that basic research and knowledge is lacking. The majority of the model simulation and games sampled are living off a very slender intellectual investment in fundamental knowledge. The need for basic research is so critical that if no other funding were available, we would favor a plan to reduce by a significant proportion all current expenditures for MSGs and to use the savings for basic research. In 1975, John Stockfish took a direct look at the use of data and combat models for managing decisions regarding conventional military forces for RAND. He emphatically stated that the need for better and more empirical work, including operational testing, is of such a magnitude that a major reallocating of talent from model building to fundamental empirical work is called for. Slide. In 1991, Paul Davis, an analyst for RAND, and Donald Blumenthal, consultant to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, published an assessment of the state of Defense Department combat modeling. It began as a discussion between the senior scientists and analysts from RAND, Livermore, and the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, sponsored an ensuing report called The Base of Sand Problem, a white paper on the state of military combat modeling. In it, Davis and Blumenthal contended the Defense Department is becoming critically dependent on combat models, including simulations and war games, even more dependent than in the past. There's considerable activity to improve model interoperability and the capabilities for distributed wargaming. In contrast to this interest in model-related technology, there's been far too little interest in the substance of the models and the validity of the lessons learned from using them. In our view, the DoD does not appreciate that in many cases, the models are built on a base of sand. The DoD's approach in developing and using combat models, including simulations and war games, is fatally flawed. So flawed that it cannot be corrected with anything less than structural changes in management and concept. Slide. Davis and Blumenthal initially drafted their white paper before the 1991 Gulf War, but the performance of the Defense Department's models and simulations in that conflict underscored the very problems they described. In early September 1991, U.S. News and World Report reported that, quote, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council estimated that the United States would lose between 20 and 30,000 dead and wounded soldiers in a Gulf War, unquote. Media reports indicated that they were derived from Defense Department computer models used to wargame possible conflict scenarios. A U.S. Army Personnel Command document that informed U.S. Central Command troop replacement planning, likely based on pre-crisis plans for the defense of Saudi Arabia against a possible Iraqi invasion, anticipated about 40,000 losses. The numbers shocked the American public and became unofficial benchmarks in subsequent public discussion and debate. In part, due to concern about potential casualties, President George H.W. Bush approved U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf's preferred concept for a flanking offensive. Despite major reinforcements and a more imaginative battle plan, U.S. CENTCOM medical personnel reportedly briefed Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell in December 1990 that they were anticipating 20,000 casualties, including 7,000 killed in action. Even as late as mid-February 1991, PERSCOM was forecasting 20,000 U.S. casualties in the first 5 days of combat. While all pre-conflict estimates of U.S. casualties in the Gulf War turned out to be too high, the Defense Department's predictions were the most inaccurate by several orders of magnitude. This performance, along with Davis and Blumenthal's scathing critique, should have called the Defense Department's entire modeling and simulation effort into question, but it did not. Slide. In 2004, defense analyst Stephen Biddle published Military Power, Explaining Victory and Defeat in Modern Battle. Biddle focused on a very basic question: what causes victory and defeat in battle? He wrote the book in response to what he perceived as an overemphasis on technological explanations for combat outcomes, i.e. the revolution of military affairs that emerged from thinking about the 1991 Gulf War by strategic and security analysts, and an underappreciation for historical continuities. One of Biddle's central critiques was that while a wide range of scholarship and policy making rests on ideas of military capability, it is a, quote, literature built on weak foundations. He observed that there are only 3 existing paradigms for analyzing success in battle: numerical preponderance, technological superiority, and force employment. After surveying some of the plethora of theories within these paradigms, Biddle concluded that, quote, there are differing views, each intuitively plausible, but none of which can be considered empirically proven. Military power was critically acclaimed and received multiple awards from academic, foreign policy, military operations research, and strategic studies organizations. For all the accolades, however, Biddle was quite aware just how neglected the study of war had become in U.S. academic and professional communities. He concluded with a very straightforward assessment. Quote, for at least a generation, the study of war's conduct has fallen between the stools of the institutional structure of modern academia and government. Political scientists often treat war itself as outside their subject matter. While its causes are seen as political and hence legitimate subjects of study, its conduct and outcomes are more often excluded. Since the 1970s, historians have turned away from the conduct of operations to focus on war's effects on social, economic, and political structures. Military officers have deep subject matter knowledge, but are rarely trained as theoreticians and have pressing operational demands on their professional attention. Policy analysts and operations researchers focus so tightly on short deadline decision analysis that underlying issues of cause and effect are often overlooked, even when the decisions under analysis turn on embedded assumptions about the causes of military outcomes. Operations research has also gradually lost much of its original empirical focus. Modeling is now a chiefly deductive undertaking with little systematic effort to test deductive claims against real-world evidence. Slide. After 2001, the focus of the defense analytical community shifted towards assessing the counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Between 2004 and 2007, there were at least 7 major large N empirical studies on the relationship between counterinsurgency and manpower by TDI, DSTL, RAND, CAA, IDA, and Dr. Jeffrey Friedman. Although there were many areas of disagreement among these studies, there was a general consensus that there was a positive relationship between counterinsurgency outcomes and manpower. However, the last US government-sponsored study on manpower and counterinsurgency ended in 2010, and Friedman published his findings in 2011. The impact of these studies on military analysis appears to have been minimal. Didn't realize that was going to be a laugh line.
Laugh or cry.
Laugh or cry, yeah. In 2012, U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, 2012 U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies thesis that assessed manpower requirements for counterinsurgency based on existing doctrine by Major James A. Zanella stated, considering the limitations of Army force planning methods, it is fair to conclude that the Army force estimates have failed to persuade civilian decision makers because the advice is not supported by a consistent, valid method for estimating the force requirements. What is clear is that the current methods have utility when dealing with military situations that mirror the conditions represented by each model. In the contemporary military operating environment, the doctrinal models no longer fit. Current Army doctrine does not provide a coherent theoretical method for determining force density requirements in contemporary operating environments.
Do you remember what I said earlier about the action you can anticipate when you restate the bloody obvious?
Yeah, and that's why I realized as I was putting this together, this is not a happy story I'm telling. Slide. Defense analysis fared no better in the years following the end of the global war on terror. In 2011, the director of the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, or CAPE, disbanded campaign modeling and reduced CAPE's participation in the support for strategic analysis process. DoD leaders had become dissatisfied with the length of time it took to conduct analytical model runs and with the relative lack of usefulness of the results. The Army Center for Army Analysis also found a lack of patience with its traditional analytical approaches. As it stated on its website, much has changed at CAA over the years. CAA once did lengthy studies of 9.5 months to a year and a half, now performs quick reaction analyses that take days, weeks, or a few months. Following the retirement of legendary Andy Yoda Marshall, the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment came under fire from critics inside the military and in Congress for failing to produce enough top secret net assessments. Instead, ONA focused its $20 million annual budget mainly on producing outside research projects, some of them of questionable value, according to critics. Slide. in reference to the recent analysis on the Russo-Ukraine conflict. In 2018, RAND published a study titled Will to Fight, analyzing, modeling, and simulating the will to fight of military units, written by analyst Ben Conable and 9 co-authors. It was sponsored by the Army G357. The study noted that both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps argue that will to fight is the single most important factor in war. However, the ground combat forces of the U.S. military have alternatively embraced and ignored the concept of will to fight for over a century. Lack of continuous emphasis on will to fight in doctrine undermines its emphasis in training, education, assessment, and analysis. U.S. Joint Force doctrine is similarly inconsistent. Our analysis shows that as of late 2017, most U.S. military war games and simulations of ground combat and combined arms combat, including representation of aerospace and naval units, either do not include will to fight or include only minor proxies of will to fight, e.g. suppression or the fear and reaction generated by near misses, that are useful but inadequate to convey its full complexity. Our initial research suggests that its influence is frequently strong and that any game or simulation of force-on-force ground combat that does not include will to fight would be misleading and perhaps dangerously so. That study came out 4 years ago. Slide. In June 2019, for a brief moment, it appeared that Congress had taken an interest in combat modeling in the base of SAND problem. The Senate Armed Services Committee initial markup of the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act contained an unusual request: evaluation of modeling and simulation used for force planning and theater operational requirements. The committee notes that the Department of Defense uses a large number and variety of computer models and simulations to support decision-making about force structure, resource allocation, wargaming, and priority weapons platforms and technologies to develop and deploy in support of likely operational scenarios. The committee is concerned that the quality, accuracy, and dependability of these models, given their important role in decision-making processes, has not been adequately validated. Therefore, the committee directs the Secretary of Defense to establish an independent team of academic and industry modeling and subject matter experts to review the quality of modeling and simulation used for force planning, wargaming, resource allocation, and other senior leader decision-making associated with the implementation of the National Defense Strategy. Unfortunately, this item did not make it into the revised version of the 2020 NDAA or the final 2020 defense budget. It is not known who inserted it into the SASC draft or why it was stripped out. Someone took interest in the issue, but for reasons unknown, did not pursue it. Slide. So in 2022, the defense analysis communities had suffered a public embarrassment on the order of that of 1991. Combat modeling and OSD resumed in 2017, and a revitalized analytic effort is currently underway called the Joint Force Operating Scenario, or JFOS. However, this effort uses many of the same combat models and simulations criticized by Davis and Blumenthal in 1991. RAND's recent observations about the lack of consideration of human factors in combat, such as the will to fight, remain unaddressed. To put a point on this situation, earlier this year, in writing about revitalizing U.S. defense planning and strategic analysis, Marine Corps strategic analysts Benjamin Jensen and Michael Roundtree observed, quote, "There's a dirty secret at the heart of defense planning. Plans, force design debates, and budget analysis all hang on arguments, assumptions, and analysis that would receive a failing grade in an undergraduate research methods seminar. The underlying logic tends to be deductive, absent sufficient analytical mechanisms to evaluate alternatives, much less consider the challenge of uncertainty. Defense strategy too often is reduced to my widget is lethal, lethality wins war, my widget will win the next war. Context, obstacles, and competition are wished away. Complex historical cases are reduced to myth-making, and trends divided into simplistic scenarios to justify predictions derived from deduction. According to Anthony Cordesman, analysis becomes ritual. As a result, policymakers find themselves driving in the dark." Slide. In 2004, 18 years ago, Stephen Biddle wrote, "Over 40 years ago, Thomas Schelling and Bernard Brody argued that without an academic discipline of military science, the study of the conduct of war has languished. The passage of time has done little to overturn their assessment. Yet the subject is simply too important to treat by proxy, an assumption on the margins of other questions. In the absence of an institutional home for the study of warfare, it is all the more essential that analysts in existing disciplines recognize its importance and take up the business of investigating capability and its causes directly and rigorously. Few subjects are more important or less studied by theoretical social scientists. With so much at stake, we must surely do better. Slide. So, unfortunately, being the Debbie Downer, I conclude on a question. Is the scientific study of combat effectively dead in the United States? Can we do better?
Doug?
Well, if it isn't depressing enough, spoiler alert, I will probably talk about this Thursday rather, in my talk as well. But the empirical basis for any kind of analysis is much, much weaker than we like to think. And my favorite example of this is probably the most studied naval battle in history is the Battle of Midway. 1983, Gordon Prang and 3 of his graduate students put out Miracle at Midway, and that became the Bible of what had happened at Midway for 40 years. Not for 40 years, sorry, for about 25. 2007, a reanalysis by people who had access to the Japanese after-action reports and could read Japanese established, among other things, that Prang had some aircraft attacking the wrong ships. Misidentified which aircraft squadrons attacked which Japanese ships. So we finally have in 2007, it's 65 years after the battle, a reasonable synopsis of the after-action reports. That's the quality of empirical data we're going to try to evaluate models with. Good luck.
Yeah.
Oh,
May I comment?
Is that what that is? You're setting up there.
There's a question in the chat. it looks like.
Oh, is there? I don't even know how to get to the chat.
Go up on top and click it.
Okay,
Oh,
that's just messed
I
up.
can hear you.
okay, good. That's what we need.
Well, that's good to know.
For the hand raise, you should be able to, all you need to do is just unmute. You just need to unmute.
He should be able to unmute himself, shouldn't he?
Yeah, I did because I don't think anybody's muted by default.
Okay.
Speak.
May I comment?
Yeah, we should be able to hear
He is
Bob.
muted.
He needs to unmute himself.
Yes, Colonel Schmidt.
I think my background is that I've participated. I've worked in the simulation branch in the Norwegian Land Group Center. I've participated in several larger exercises over the last 5 years, looking at how they train the NATO corps and how they train the brigades underneath the corps and so on. So the thing that I've seen is not very reassuring, because the effect of what you're pointing at is that you don't have any simulation models that are validated, so they give widely unrealistic results. And that means that all commanders and staffs and participants in such exercises, they are fed with unreal and hugely inaccurate outcomes of combat. And you can imagine what that means for professional education. I think there's a huge challenge with regard to pedagogics in this, is that to try to explain what's the impact of this lack of research actually does to our professional training and education, and thus also makes a very disadvantageous impact on our possible preparedness for larger exercises, or not exercises, but operations. So I think one way to actually try to approach this is try to show what might be the consequences of this.
Sasha, I think you were next.
How much of this is just the dynamic produced by a peacetime army? It feels like this, because it feels like if you look at a lot of, there's resistances, it's, for
How do
example,
I
if
make
you
a
add
comment?
in a lot more of that kind of statistical rigor, it means the people above you in the chain who are reviewing, who are writing your OERs, turns out they're wrong. If you're saying, well, it's not widget A that's gonna matter, well, suddenly defense contractor B is gonna be pissed off, and officer C, who wants to get a job with defense contractor B when he retires, he's gonna be pissed off as well, he's gonna be annoyed as well. So like, how much of this is just what an army looks like when it's not facing an when it's in peacetime and not facing an existential threat?
I think there's a lot of validity to that statement, but I also want to point out that I don't think there's many people from MORS, Military Operations Research Community, here today. I think there's a reason why. Well, there's a reason why Chris doesn't get invited to these big events.
Either.
Yeah. The people pointing out that the emperor had no clothes are not very popular, and when it is pointed out, there is usually a considerable amount of pushback, saying, "Oh no, the situation's fine. All our models are great." Chris can speak to this much more.
Well, my additional point is that we are a wartime army. We have the Korean War, we have the Vietnam War, we have Gulf War, Iran, Iraq, Iraq, Afghanistan. We have been constantly, and since 2001, we have been constantly floating in and out of wars throughout this whole period of when operations research started doing combat modeling in the 50s. And so, we have been in and out of a wartime environment the whole time. You will not find any statistical analysis studies coming out of Vietnam War, for example. The whole operations research and combat modeling community was there. They didn't bother to study that war. And of course, the purpose of a peacetime army is to prepare for the next war. So the argument is that this is typical of a peacetime army. I would argue that shouldn't be the argument. This is the peacetime army should be preparing for the next war, and they appear to be getting closer.
If I could just.
I think the next gentleman who had his hand up is over here.
Just quickly, the concerns about the quality of the historical information used in the models echoes the concerns in the commercial world in connection with the data sets used in machine learning, for example. And so I would say that these concerns are doubly important to the extent that the Department of Defense and others are using artificial intelligence. If the data is flawed, good call. What is the result? So I would say this is a very interesting and relevant conversation.
I'm not sure who is next. Yeah, Joe.
Professor Woodford, that was a elevating briefing. Thanks for putting that together and presenting it here today. And I do have one optimistic thing that I think might be worthy of your consideration for inclusion in it.
I'm hoping to hear rays, little shits of green and rays of light.
Yeah,
I would like to make a
Thank you,
comment.
I
Somebody mentioned,
and
why
I already know where
do the winners win and why do the losers lose? If I may say so
In a
myself,
30-day period.
I have the best current answer to that
committed to
question,
publish the book.
which will be presented in my talk on Wednesday at
In
11.
that book, you get better than any governmental organization in predicting how Desert Storm would look and what the casualty rate would be. And he used a method that is still in existence. So while I completely agree, how could I not, with everything you presented, and there is massive room for improvement, there is one standout historical event that remains fairly impressive. And the fact is that in 30 days, Trevor, we pulled off an estimate that was better than anybody using his TNDM method. And that's one of the reasons I'm in this room. Because I do think that, TNDM, QGM has value for the country still. And that also needs to be elevated. It needs to be brought more contemporary, needs to perhaps include naval and air components. But there is some grounds for optimism, despite the substantial grounds for pessimism in your briefing that are valid.
I think Doug was actually next in line. Lost track of him.
We have been actively at war against an existential threat since December of 2019. The biological threat of COVID-19. We don't know. We think that it was of natural origin. It could have been man-made. And again, spoiler alert for what I'm going to say tomorrow. If this one was not man-made, we sure as hell showed anybody who wanted to do it how to do it and what it would look like. Now, how much analysis has there been, good analysis, of how well we responded to that and what we should be doing differently? I'll leave some of what I'm going to say tomorrow for you to come and hear. Bottom line, the peacetime analysis Scowcroft Institute had laid out what you do in response to a pandemic. And by June of 2020, it was pretty clear that we had done almost exactly the opposite of what they recommended and continued to do so. I'll say more about this Tuesday, but I think the idea that somehow we're going to learn once we face a threat is wildly optimistic. The peacetime analysis in the 1930s informed most of the things we did right during World War II. There was some great wargaming done then. Wargaming, for my money, having done quite a bit of both, is much, much better than simulation. Because simulation tends to be constrained by an organizational culture that says, you've got to
I
prove
would
to me
like to
that
make a
results
comment.
really do conform to reality. It's got to be accredited. You've got to show me there's some other source that supports your conclusion. If you get a model that's fully accredited, so everything that came out of that model is not a surprise, it's supported by something else, the model is useless for analysis. It can't surprise you. What are you using it for? War games don't have that drawback. I mean, they do. We have some interesting tangles over what the report will look like when a surprise develops, but at least the surprises have a way of leaking into consciousness in the organization.
I would like to make a comment.
I like what we just said here. I was looking at it on several levels of abstraction. On a foundational level, we understand mostly what weapon systems can do. And models are usually built at that level. But as you extract a little bit higher, there's a question of how is it normally done? How are they normally employed? A weapon system has a range of X, but it's normally employed at a range of 0.5X or something like that. But there's some flexibility in there that makes it go. And then as we extend to the abstract higher and higher, we eventually get to the thing of the will to fight, which I have never seen anything that describes how we can predict the will to fight. And I'm speaking from somebody sitting with Marines a couple of days before Ukraine kicked off, and I was telling them Russia was not going to attack because Russia did not have the capability of beating the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians chose to fight. Their only hope is to intimidate them so they won't. And I had a lot of reasons. I was wrong. Russia did it. Russia attacked, but everything played out the way I described because they didn't have the logistics. They didn't have, there's a lot of factors that would evolve, but ultimately there's a will to fight. And that's the factor that I don't know why did Stalin survive the Russian attack or the German attack? Nobody knows. It could have collapsed. It came close to collapse. How do we know that? Will to fight is that highest level extraction. And I don't think we have any good way of predicting that. Maybe I'm just completely wrong. but it also makes it that we can wave away any model result that doesn't match reality because, oh, we didn't properly capture the role of fire.
Well, David, Daniel Horvath, apparently you're the only one who can hear me.
Intelligence Office, which is a very small corner of the State Department, very small outfit. I did have dinner a couple months ago with one of the members of it. According to him, they were the one intelligence outfit that was saying that the Ukrainians were going to fight. Their entire analytical basis for that was a survey they did, a public opinion poll that they contracted and they did over in Ukraine. And on that single public opinion poll, they based the conclusion that the Ukrainians were going to fight. It was not going to be a Russian walkover. But I gather from inside the U.S. intel agency, and I don't know what else was being said inside the agency, but I gather they were one of the few people who were saying the Ukrainians were going to fight. But again, it was based upon a single public opinion poll.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not in-depth analysis, even though it was correct. I would be extremely insecure to base a conclusion on a single poll.
Yes.
I think Dr. Spaggett was actually next, and then.
Okay, this is what I'm gonna say, but there seems to be some issue going on with the remote people. I'm not sure
I
if.
think, yeah, Bob Helmold I think he's making comments in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I had my own comment, but I keep seeing that they seem to be upset.
And he teased us with a comment saying that he knows why winners win and losers lose.
Okay.
So can we hear them? Do we have a speaker here that projects what they're saying?
Good morning, gentlemen. If I
We're
speak,
not
can
able
you
to get
hear
the
me?
speaker connected. If we could have them just kind of type out what they want to.
Is the speaker on the computer?
Can you hear me?
If there is, it's a little tinny speaker on this laptop.
He was on mute when you pulled up the list. He was on mute.
Presumably they know how to unmute
Yeah, they can
themselves.
unmute themselves. So I don't.
Yeah, I don't think it's a mute problem. I think it's a problem of getting the audio feed coming in to the speakers.
Okay.
Is there a way maybe to just like if you are connecting your audio feed from your computer to these speakers to maybe disconnect that link and then to have it just come out of your computer?
Maybe.
I've been trying to make a comment.
You're right that we have a technical issue here.
Do you want me to get?
Could say we have a failure to communicate.
Who was the next person?
I was gonna make a comment, but I diverted to that. So what I was gonna say is that, so we know we just lost a 20-year war in Afghanistan to which tremendous resources were invested, but, and I think probably almost everyone in this room is closer to actual people serving in the military than I am. But so far as I can see from where I sit there was nobody whose career was wrecked over this. There may have been like subtle damages, like some guy didn't get, some promotion that he might have because it was thought that, he didn't do so well in Afghanistan. But the point being, there doesn't seem to be a strong reason why people have to pay attention to the question of like, how can we do better? How can we improve our chances of winning? People are operating in some career environment where their promotions are not really dependent on whether, the whole operation that they're a small part of is being successful. So they can just ignore this stuff and, there's not going to be a consequence so far as I can see.
I have a comment on that.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think my understanding of the reason what you're actually talking about is that when it comes to simulation, for example, as I talked about, it's no problem with the professional input to correct the combat model. If you have a combat model that's not correct, you can just adjust during the exercise. Okay, you lost twice as many as you should have, and you just get them back, or if the artillery is too powerful, you just adjust and whatever. The really big issue that you actually addresses is about operations and campaigns. Because those models, if they are wrong, you can start a war on the wrong preconditions, which we have just seen. And you can go into a war, and if your it's like chess. If your base, if your jump off positions are wrong, and your pre-calculations are wrong, and your pre-stopping is wrong, you'll lose. So that's the big issue here, and I think it might help to explain why it is not that, why it's not addressed that seriously at the necessary levels. Is that their experience is from the exercises, even very huge NATO exercises, where they survive, they can adjust, so, but they haven't seen, okay, what's the preconditions for starting the war in Afghanistan, for example, or going in. So I think fine.
Yeah, to respond, I think that's a great point. I think that was along the lines. I mean, there's I think disconnects at many levels in the analytical support to decision making. But there was a quote that I did include in my presentation that was an epigraph to the Ben Jensen comment on the state of current analytical support to decision making from Undersecretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary of Defense Kat Hicks, to the effect that she and the Secretary of Defense are highly reliant on quality analysis in order to make good decisions. So our decision makers, the people at the top, are dependent on the quality of analysis that's provided to them. We know there's a problem with the analysis, but we don't seem to be able to close those gaps and make it better.
Yes, we'll just keep moving around the table.
In direct continuation from that, I've got huge sympathy with the gentleman over there. When we are, our nations have been at war continuously on and off for decades, we know that. But actually, notwithstanding that, there is a huge institutional base, some of it military, some of it civilian, some of it academic, which isn't at war and doesn't think of it as if we're at war. And the whole dynamics of that institutional base aren't supporting the war effort, which I think is a point that you made. But just to put your finger on that, right now today in Amsterdam, there is a historical conference about war and warfare. It's attracted 148 papers from, I think, 40 different countries. And I look through the running, and there is some world-class history there. Really, really famous names that you've all heard of. But I am willing to bet that not a single one of those papers will change military practice that much. They, the institutional base, whatever you want to call it, some of which is academic, some of which is institutional, some of which is military, aren't addressing the problem the right way. And I think that's, can we do better? Of course we can. But it's a pretty big job, it's a pretty big ask to actually do that. It's fairly fundamental.
I've got to follow up on Dr. York's comment. I think he hit one really key thing. You've got three different elements looking at this issue. If they're looking at it independently, they will fail. I think the key solution is you have to actually synergize the three thinking methodologies in order to make sure that one of the constituent thinking groups doesn't miss cranial elements of the other two, because they're all critical. The academia is critical because we need that PhD level critical thinking and analysis. But I'll also say, with a bias that I apologize for, that if you're doing this and trying to solve it, and you don't have military minds who have done it for 30 years on the ground in uniform and seen blood, I think you're making a mistake. And then I also think that you do need the institutions involved, because those institutions have critical institutional knowledge at spectral level. So I don't think there's a solution that's ever going to be led to that becomes a crystal ball like solution on the outcomes of combat, unless you synergize those three entities. And even once you do that, because you've got variables, because we're dealing with human beings, there's always going to be error. You're never going to have a perfect system. So you're not going to go for perfect. What you're going for is something better than all the broke things that Dr. Woodford put up there on the board. And again, I go back to, in 30 days, he had the best estimate of what was going to happen in Desert Storm. And when you look at what Schwarzkopf did, and you look at what's in the book, they're near identical. So there is the potentiality for a much better conversational context than what we see happen and what Rand has, illustrated that Shawn put up on the screen.
I think Dr. McKay, General Howard.
So, Shawn, I appreciated your presentation very much. And nothing that you said I disagree with. To quickly answer your two questions.
I would like to make a
Is
comment.
this type work dead? It's not dead, but it is certainly undervalued. It is hugely undervalued and it's not trusted. The second question, can we improve? Absolutely. And I think there's two specific areas. These are big areas in my mind. So in war plans, we do modeling in sims. We do. And they produce the most horrendous force packages. Sometimes US plans, the modeling and sims require forces that exceed the DoD inventory. They're just wildly inaccurate. So they're not trusted. So that's one of the problems is, and you talked about it an awful lot, the data that goes into it, the historical analysis that goes into it, we don't have it right. We are doing it, but we're getting it wrong routinely. That's the first problem. I think the second problem is the historical analysis that goes into this type of modeling in sims moves at a pace that does not fit our political decision-making in time of crisis. We've all, well, not we all, he and I certainly have, we went to Army schools and you're taught that, the national leaders come up with a problem statement and they give it to you and you do what submission analysis on what they tell you they want and you come up with a plan. Well, what really happens is something bad happens around the world and national leaders say, what can you do? They said, what can you do? And then your natural question, whispering to yourself, is to accomplish what? There's no accomplish what in that initial analysis. It's what can you do? And then so you say, well, here's the 950,000 things I can do. And they say, okay, develop this one, and this one. And that's the extent of the analysis that goes into it. Typically, that involves the size of the force. So somebody on this side of the room said, the analysis was completely ignored by political leaders. I think it was in Afghanistan. It absolutely was, because those numbers were astronomical. And those were correct numbers, in my opinion. And what really happened was, what can you do with 1,000 people, with 3,000 people, with 5,000 people, with these arbitrary numbers that were politically tenable? That is the second question that we're struggling. The first is, in summary, we are doing modeling in sims, but we are doing it wrong. And I think it's because of all the things Shawn said. We have the wrong data, the wrong historical analysis, et cetera. The second question is, political leaders are not compelled to use this kind of analysis. It's more of political expediency than, in order to accomplish a political objective, I need this military force. That's the second problem, I think.
Draw your attention also to the comments by Mr. Horvath and Underwood that are in the chat.
Can I make a comment?
Hello.
Hello?
Good.
Okay. My great comment is that the World War II Bible on operations research by Morrison Kimball specifically states the operations research unit must be attached at the highest
Which makes a number of things
operational
people said
level
at that last comment there.
to
The
be
big question is, what does a
any
learning
value.
organization look like in the new era of data science? So certainly in academia, in data science, so often you see, okay, they come to you with this data, they've got the wrong data, they designed the experiment wrong. Or a computer scientist comes in and says, hit it with this ML AI technique, it'll tell us that it's sort of black box science. And we absolutely need an organization which always steps back, is critical, is scientific, is skeptical, thinks actually, but this context, that one. And I think that's the sort of thing that needs a little bit of slow thinking and historical thinking. And certainly my sense when stuff was happening, when there was a chap called Dominic Cummings, people must have heard of, trying to revolutionize data in the number 10 policy unit. Yeah, but there's a danger that he's too sort of starry-eyed with whizzy data stuff. And you always need people who understand, have absolute mastery of the data science so that they can say, no, that's bullshit, that's garbage in, garbage out.
I think that's a very excellent comment. Chris published an article in, was it Phalanx, right?
Yeah,
Recently.
Phalanx.
Yeah,
Got
and,
no response.
well, and Chris made the point that the people analyzing the data should be the people who also collect and organize the data. Because if there's a disconnect there, the people who are analyzing the data don't understand the data well enough to understand why there's a problem or an anomaly. They need to be, yeah.
They should understand the data and they should understand the models. They should
Exactly.
understand the stuff in the black box.
Exactly. A lot of times now you have analysts who are trained in analytical methods, but they're not trained in research. And they just take the data as is and try to make sense of it.
Gentlemen, shall we take a 5-minute break and then I'll start my briefing? Okay.
Great stuff, Sean.
Thank you.